Hello and welcome back. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I'm doing my July reading wrap-up. This was a bit of a spare month. I've been reading quite a few big long books lately, and it's been taking up a lot of time. I also listened to the entirety of a very long podcast, which I'll get into in a bit, that kind of counts as a book, but not really. So it's not a lot of books this month, but that's okay. This will be quick, and the stuff that I did read was really good. So let's get into it. The first item on the list is series that I finished this month, and I don't know if this really counts because it's not really a series, but I did finish my Jane Austen read-through with Persuasion. This was the last book chronologically that she published. And I really enjoyed this one. This was a lot of fun. It was a really satisfying conclusion to kind of my mini marathon of all 6 of her books. And it was, this is one that I hadn't read before. So it was kind of a new experience because there was 3 of them that I had read and then 3 that I hadn't read. And so getting to experience kind of all of her books in publication order was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this one. Characters were great. The conclusion was really satisfying. And the romantic tension at the heart of this one is really, really good. So not really a series, but it was a reading series that I finished. Next up is series that I started in the month of July. And again, this is a series I've read before, so it's not really a new series that I've started, but I reread Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, and not necessarily this edition, I have read this one before, but this was the new audiobook versions narrated by Kristen Atherton, which were really, really good. I'm excited to kind of continue that series. I've been getting them through Libro FM, and so they've been coming out usually once every month or every other month so far. So I've got the first 2. The third one comes out end of this month, so I'll probably get that next month when I get to it. But this is still one of my all-time favorite books. It's just perfect. Every time I read it, it's just as good. This is one of those ones where every time you don't ever pick up flaws or it becomes sort of samey and boring every time you read it. This is genuinely one of those books that it's wonderful. And then there are some valid criticisms of the series as a whole that I've seen, and that's totally fine. But this book will forever be one of my all-time favorites. I love it so much. And the new narration really does a good job of making you look at the story in kind of new ways. I know when you read the physical book or the ebook, the characters are all sort of, you can picture what what they sound like in your head. And with the Davina Porter narration, the old audiobooks, with hers, it's she does all the accents so well, but I think her Claire does sound a little bit older. She maybe sounds like she's in her 40s, even in the first book. And I think in this one, with Kristen Atherton narrating it, she really sounds like she's late 20s, like she is in the book. So love this one so much. It was so much fun to revisit, and I'm looking forward to going through the whole series again, leading up to the release of the final book. So we'll see when that happens. Next up is favorite nonfiction reads. And like I said, I went through a podcast that took up quite a bit of time, end of June, beginning of July. And that was the History of Rome podcast by Michael Duncan. I think it's Michael Duncan. Mike Duncan. Yes, and that was really fantastic. It was basically like an audiobook of the entire history of Rome, starting in kind of the mythological era and going into kind of recorded history and everything. And I really enjoyed that one. And so when I finished with that, then I read Mary Beard's SPQR, and this book was spectacular. And it was really interesting kind of getting the history of Rome in 2 different ways, because the first one, the podcast, is very chronological. It's very focused on the rulers, who was in charge, what happened with succession of each subsequent ruler, and sort of overall what the big political picture looked like as things changed throughout the years. And it covers everything. And this one was a little bit different. Mary Beard's approach is a lot more about talking about what we know about ancient Rome. And so the first chapter starts with Cicero, which is kind of right in the middle of things, talking about an event that's very well documented, something where we for sure know everything that happened. And then she kind of goes back and talks about the early days and the archaeological information that we have and the historical information that we have, and how everything comes to create this sort of image of ancient Rome that sort of exists in people's minds, and how that sort of changes over time, because there's some history books that are, commissioned by people in charge who are vested in kind of changing history, and then you've got history written sort of 100 years after the fact, and they're working with primarily secondary sources, and so it's fairly accurate but not 100%. And so like Mary Beard's whole thing is she's focusing on what details about ancient Rome, the culture, the people, the government, the events of everything, how do we know what we know based on sort of verifiable facts, and what elements feel more like mythology or wishful thinking. And so it was a really compelling sort of approach to the topic, especially after going through Mike Duncan's podcast, which was very just, here's the chronology of sort of what happened in ancient Rome from a kind of a bird's eye view. And with this one, she's very focused on ground level stuff, and what was the people like, and the food and the culture, and how did the events happening to the government and whatnot affect the people on the ground level. And I really, really appreciated it. So this was a lot of fun. Also, I will say this book is a lot longer than it seems. It does not look that huge, but it's like a 600-page book. The pages are very thin, and it took me a long time to get through this. So this kind of ate up most of the month. And then I started, of course, another really long book right after this that I'm still going through. So that's kind of part of the reason why I haven't read that many books this month. But that's okay. This was a good one. Next up is my favorite fiction standalone, and there's only one book that I read that was a fiction standalone, and that was Hera by Jennifer Saint. I really enjoyed this one. Probably my second favorite of all of Jennifer Saint's books that I've read. I've read 4 of them, and this is probably also her biggest one. This is quite a hefty book. But what I liked about this one is that she's not necessarily telling the story of one particular myth. She's telling the story of kind of the rise and fall of the Olympian gods as a whole from the point of view of Hera, and the overarching kind of through line that goes through it all is Hera's conflict with Zeus, and how she had to sort of toe the line to actually have any influence whatsoever while being sort of suppressed and pushed down, because Hera is a lot more powerful than I think the myths give her credit. And when you have so many stories, especially like the Iliad and the Odyssey, we see Hera sort of afraid of Zeus's power and having to sort of work within his limits, because she can't do anything that would upset him, and so she has to do everything that she can sneakily. And this really does a good job of sort of making that whole thing into a cohesive story. Also, what I really liked about this one is that it looks at her gray areas, the things that she does that aren't good, and it really turns her into a complex, interesting, multifaceted character. She's not a good heroic character. I don't think any of the Olympian gods are, but she's not an evil, mustache-twirling villain either. She's not kind of a cardboard cutout like she so often is. And so we get this image of someone who is driven by jealousy and frustration and rage, and wants to be someone who can have some kind of impact on the world in a meaningful way, but isn't able to. And so we see all the things that she does and all of the different myths that she interacts with. So I really enjoyed this one, and would highly recommend it. Finally, I've got books that surprised me and books that disappointed me, and there's only one book left that I read this month, and it kind of fits both topics, and that is The Hour of the Dragon by Robert E. Howard. This is his Conan the Cimmerian book. He's written lots of short stories and novellas and novelettes in that world, but this is his only novel set in the world. And in terms of the Conan chronology, it's kind of in the middle, where he's a king, and of course there's an evil wizard who takes over his land, and he's exiled, and he has to kind of fight to regain his kingdom. And I really enjoyed it. It's pulp 1930s sword and sorcery stuff, so it's basically just really large man with big arms punches bad guys and wins over and over and over again. And there's monsters, and there's like a vampire queen, and like it's great, but it's very much like pretty simplistic stuff. It's not quite on the level of like grimdark fantasy. Sword and Sorcery feels like kind of a predecessor to grimdark, but it's very much one of those kinds of things where the hero's going to win always, so there's not really a ton of stakes. It's just fun to watch the big strong hero beat everyone up, and it's really violent, and it's fun. Now, the one thing about it that disappointed me was, while he handles women decently well, they don't get a lot of character, obviously. There's no character depth or whatsoever, but they're depicted as very strong and capable. And of course, Conan himself, his whole thing is like chivalry, so he'll never hurt a woman, and he does everything he can to kind of protect them. But the women, of course, are also very capable and are strong and able to kind of handle themselves. And so it's more like they team up for a bit, and he kind of helps her escape something, and then, they go their own separate ways. But the way that he handles sort of characters with darker skin is not great. And I know it was sort of a product of its time, but like there was good authors in the 30s who were writing really fantastic, nuanced depictions of non-white characters. So, I know it's pulp and it's meant to be just kind of silly and whatever, but it very much reflects sort of the worst prejudices of the time, because Conan himself is a barbarian. Like, that's his whole thing. And even though he's a king in this book, his whole ethos is like civilization is kind of a disease. It's always doomed to fail, and the only thing you can count on is like yourself out in the wild, kind of thing. And so he's a barbarian and whatever, and that's fine. But then whenever you meet a barbarian who is darker skinned and who is from like a different culture, they're the ones that get depicted like animalistically and are depicted as like lesser and not very smart, and they have to kind of be led and directed by the more smart barbarian. And it just felt really outdated. Thankfully, it's not a huge part of the book. That's maybe like 2 small sections, and you can kind of skip through them. But, that was a little sad, because for the most part, the vibes of this book are genuinely a lot of fun. And I know it's reflective of its time, but still, I just feel like that's one of those things that hasn't aged well. And it's sad, because there's really good authors from that era that were writing really forward-thinking, intelligent stuff. And I get that Robert E. Howard wasn't intending to appeal to the sort of intellectual masses. He was writing pulp fantasy, but still, it's more sad in that it wouldn't have really been seen as all that shocking, because to the everyday person who wasn't clued into sort of the up-and-coming intellectual fiction of the time, a lot of everyday people would have really been like, oh, that's fine. And so we can look back on it and learn from it, hopefully, which is good. But Robert E. Howard is no longer with us, so you're not really hurting anyone by reading these books, but it is a good idea to still talk about these things and to make sure that people aren't taking any of their depictions of other people's to heart too much, and realize that that's not a very good depiction. But moving on, that's kind of all I read in the month of July. There was lots of really long books, and so it took me a while to get through them. And that's interesting, because I did a video a while back talking about how oftentimes you feel sort of disinclined to read really big books because you won't be able to create as interesting content, or as much interesting content as you normally would. Because if you read lots of stuff that's sort of short and simple, you can read a lot of stuff, and then you can talk about a bunch of different books in your wrap-ups or hauls or whatever. And when you read long, complicated books that take more of a commitment, you don't have as much to tick off on that like reading list. And that's just something that I think we need to be aware of, because I've really enjoyed everything that I read the past month, but there was that little voice that was always like, there's not really a lot of books that you have to talk about this month. and that's kind of like disappointing because it'd be fun to talk about more books. But what I am reading is more meaningful, complicated stuff that's challenging and compelling and deep, and so I'm okay with that. But there is that voice inside your head that you are kind of constantly fighting, and that has to do with like the algorithm and wanting to sort of be always exciting and new and different and able to talk about things that people haven't heard of before so you can get lots of views, and we don't need to do that. So I'm just going to talk about the stuff that I read that I enjoyed, and we're kind of leave it at that. And there's a cat here, and so she needs lots of attention, so I'm gonna go and deal with that. And in the meantime, enjoy your reading, and I will see you next week. All right, bye bye.